Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight, City Lights, in conjunction with Stanford University Press, is pleased to present Jennifer Jihye Chun and Hui Judy Han. They will be discussing their new book, Against Abandonment, Repertoires of Solidarity in South Korean Protest. It is published by our friends over at Stanford University Press. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. It is always an honor and a privilege to do so. In Against Abandonment, our evening's guests explore how protests for social justice in South Korea not only hold a significant place in culture at large, but also connect to a larger transnational context. Based upon long-term ethnographic research with labor and social movement activists, Against Abandonment demonstrates how struggles for justice and workers' rights are inextricably connected to the globalized conditions of neoliberal capitalism. Protest is explored as a political form with far-reaching resonance across history and geography, and underscores the significance of collective survival, self-determination, and emancipatory transformation. Jennifer Jihye Chun is a sociologist and professor of Asian American Studies and Labor Studies at the University of California in Los Angeles. Hui Judy Han is a geographer and assistant professor of gender studies at the University of California in Los Angeles. It is such a great honor to have them both with us here tonight. They're doing really amazing work. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to Jennifer Jihye Chun and Julie Han. It is such a pleasure once again to have you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter and
Thank
City
you.
Lights. And thank you also to Adam and Dylan at Stanford University Press who did the marketing and who made this possible for us. We're used to usually giving lectures about the book and giving presentations, more of a research-based, social sciencey research lecture about the book, but we decided to try something a little bit different today and read passages from the book as much as we can, but also accompanied by some photos. So let me start with the photos here. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to go right ahead into the introduction. This is from page 1 of our book. Kim Seung-ha, who is the head of the Korean Train Express KTX Crew Workers Union, stood at the base of the steps leading up to the main entrance of the of the Seoul Central Station. Sorry, I'm already having a little bit of, just a second. There we go. She stood at the base of the steps leading up to the main entrance of the Seoul Central Station, surrounded by fellow workers and supporters on what was undoubtedly a momentous occasion. It was the summer of 2018, sorry, that says 2017. This was 12 years after KTX workers first began their strike in protest of the unequal and unjust conditions of 비정규직, or what is commonly translated as precarious, irregular, or non-regular employment. So this was a press conference to mark their reinstatement after a total of 13 years of fighting for it. The union was finally able to negotiate a collective agreement with the Korea Railroad Corporation, and 180 women who worked as crew attendants on the nation's first high-speed bullet train would be directly hired as Korail employees. The details of their reinstatement were still to be determined, and only a few of the laid-off workers would likely return to their coveted jobs, once known as flight attendants on the ground. That was their job, as train attendants. But the moment was triumphant. Holding the microphone with tears in her eyes, Kim Seung-ha, who you see in the photo, addressed the crowd in disbelief. She emphasized the grueling nature of their fight, highlighting the duration of 4,526 days and the many places that they once occupied in protest. Seoul Central Station was not just a train station to them. It was where they had once worked, where they fought to demand justice and dignity, where they slept in tent encampments, and then where they announced the end of their long struggle. No one could have imagined, including the KTX workers themselves, that when this all began, young, college-educated women who epitomized the normative ideals of femininity and grace would launch and eventually win the kind of fight to the death that is typically associated with militant unionism in South Korea. In a much photographed direct action in 2006, striking KTX train attendants tie themselves to each other while wearing matching form-fitting crew attendants uniforms consisting of light gray skirt suits and bright multicolored neck scarves. Their leaders shaved their heads and waged long hunger strikes in subsequent years. And they fought so hard and staged so many occupations at the train station, at politicians' offices, and many other government buildings that a journalist once quipped that there was not a place that a KTX unionists had not at least once occupied. Even as their numbers declined sharply from 300 at its height to merely 34 after an unsuccessful 3-year-long workplace occupation, the remaining workers refused to abandon the fight. The loss of workers' lives in the context of anti-union retaliation and ongoing labor protests, we won't get into the details of the KTX struggle, but not just for KTX workers, for other unions too. The kinds of struggles that they take on over a long period of time is what we focus on in this book. And Jennifer, page 4.
And so, in many ways, to those who are familiar with South Korea's vibrant culture of labor protest, KTX's union fight would likely not be surprising. Like in many other labor protests, the KTX unionists engaged in everything from confrontational direct action and occupation of public spaces, just to name a couple, to holding head shaving ceremonies and prayer protests over the course of their long and protracted fight. Put together, these protest actions and events comprise a remarkable protest that has taken on urgency and significance in the context of the life-depriving conditions of globalized neoliberal capitalism. Political geographer and abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore refers to the predatory conditions of capitalist domination as the death-dealing forces of an extractive system of racial capitalism that resolves its perennial crises of accumulation and profitability through, quote, fatal couplings of power and difference. So in the US, racism and its intersectional relations of social inequality and oppression has functioned as the dominant modality in which minoritized groups, especially Black workers, have been subject to a premature death. Yet in South Korea, we found that workplaces and labor markets are largely stratified by gender as well as age and employment status, among other axes of social inequality. And this has rendered women workers in precarious jobs, as well as the rural and urban poor, disabled people, and sexual minorities, vulnerable to the kind of intensified relations of abandonment that we examined are produced by labor commodification. And these relations have fundamentally degraded people's ability to survive, let alone flourish. So in thinking about the death-dealing forces of globalized neoliberal capitalism and these life-depriving conditions that workers in precarious jobs are subjected to, we began to really try to examine, what role protest plays in fighting and also transforming these conditions. A book about protest politics in South Korea, Against Abandonment, Repertoires of Solidarity and South Korean Protest, really chronicles these long-term struggles waged by workers, women, and other minoritized social groups who use protest and the ability to intensify its affective charge through the choice and combination of tactics, symbols, scripts, and performances in the broader repertoire to essentially amplify these life and death stakes of refusing precarity. And as one of the leading agents of repertoire amplification, workers, many of whom are women in precarious jobs, like the KTX train attendants we profiled at the beginning, really spearhead these grueling battles that last months and sometimes years with no end in sight. Their labor disputes usually begin with a fairly routine pattern. And what we found was that no one begins this type of protracted labor struggle expecting to fight months and years with no kind of foreseeable end. Usually they join or form a union, and then typically they demand collective bargaining as the primary arena in which to resolve their grievances. Everything from unfair working conditions and other sort of unjust and often discriminatory terms of employment. Yet, as unions that represent workers in precarious jobs encounter unyielding opposition and repeated legal setbacks, they face the Arendtian denial of the quote, right to have rights. They confront the violence of the law itself, which is a vital means for expressing grievances and demanding institutional protection, but subjects those who oppose this relentless devaluation of human life under globalization's necropolitical order to a quote, life of waste and absolute expendability. And this is drawing on the work of Neferti Tadier.
So in response to these challenges, the workers turn to protest forms that we believe stretch a sense of time and space. This includes the high altitude protests that that's in the photo of the cover of the book, 고공농성. And it's a variation of place-based occupation protests in which protesters not only occupy a space and go without necessities like warm and safe shelter, running water and electricity, and sometimes even food for prolonged periods, but they also endure extreme isolation at perilous altitudes as a way to literally heighten the stakes of their struggles. The KTX occupation of a 40-meter high steel tower behind the Seoul Central Station is one of over 100 high altitude occupations that have taken place between 1990 and 2015, demonstrating a sense of embodied and transhistorical connectedness that extend across space. These include face-to-face encounters and digital networks too. And in time, through connections of past and future struggles, there's a sense of belonging to a community of protests. Slow-moving and painstaking processions, like the one you see in the photo, influenced by the Tibetan Buddhist rituals of Samboilbe, which is a half prostration procession, 3 steps and a bow, and Ochetuji, which is a full prostration procession, which this is actually the photo that you're seeing, and I'll show you a video clip right after this so you can get a sense of it. The full prostration procession direct one's attention to the spectacle of bodies crawling underground. KTX unionists performed a 3.8-kilometer long Ochetuji on the 4,223rd day of their fight, as the temperature dipped below 3 degrees Celsius. It's nearly freezing. Its scale or difficulty might pale in comparison to the 5-day-long 15-kilometer Ochetuji, the procession that was performed by laid-off Kiryung electronics workers in December 2014, which marked the end of their decade-long fight. But it was nonetheless an agonizing and sobering display of bodies protesting in motion. And this is what an Ochetuji procession looks like. we discussed a variety of protest forms in our book, and this particular form, ochetuji, is the definition includes the requirement of 5 parts of your body touching the ground, and that's the forehead, elbows, and knees. And it's extremely physically demanding and a grueling form of protest. And not everyone does it, but a lot of workers embrace this form, usually to mark a special, a particularly, a particular moment of escalation or conclusion of their struggle, such as in this case. Jennifer?
So we had really been following this turn to an increasingly dramatic and kind of embodied repertoire of protest really between the mid 2000s until we completed our field work in 2017. And, as we started thinking about why we're seeing, this type of protest repertoire, we became animated by a singular question. And that is, why, in the face of misrecognition, abjection, and failure, do protesters continue to protest, and in even more desperate registers? So, one answer to this puzzle, which is often echoed by workers' own words and often repeated in media accounts and also in the academic scholarship, is that these protesters are in fact desperate, right? After doing everything that they can think of and more, they reach the end of a losing battle, having diminished their strength in numbers, punished and exhausted their bodies and minds, and put their livelihoods, families, and futures in extreme peril. And, you can hear sort of many, many sort of accounts that really repeat this. And when we often would give early talks about this research, we often got that question. It was either didn't workers really, resort to these high altitude occupation protests because they had sort of no other choices left to try to get their jobs back? Or, didn't they do this as a last ditch effort to try to get some public attention for their struggles, especially in the media? And, those explanations aside, the more that we started, visiting multiple protest sites, especially over these protracted periods, and talking to workers and supporters themselves, we really came up with a different understanding of why protesters continue to protest that moves us beyond desperation. So in our book, we argue that protest repertoires entail much more than what movements do, or seek or claim to do, in order to achieve their goals. Crucially, protest repertoires shape how movements move. And by move, we refer not only to the flow of bodies in motion across time and space, or the feelings and sentiments generated when one is moved emotionally, but also to the catalytic affects that operate on a different register from emotions. Rather than reside in the interior life of individuals, affect circulates and gains traction between and across bodies and places, movements, and atmospheres. And we became especially interested in affect as a relational force, echoing feminist philosopher Sarah Ahmed, who writes that affect can align, quote, individuals with communities or bodily space with social space through the very intensity of their attachments, end quote. Repeatedly performing acts that reference a modular repertoire of extralegal performances, symbols, and discourses, then, begin to kind of circulate these affective charges in ways that generate solidarity as, quote, affect in motion. They begin to really forge a sense of connection that ties people, places, objects, and scenes together through the doing and feeling of protest, through shared practices and collective memory. We came to this conclusion drawing on over 2 decades of ethnographic research, as we talked about earlier. And what we really sought to do in the book was to provide a searing examination, right, based on our ethnography of the utility and futility of protest in challenging the indignity of precarity as a life-depriving system, right? Um, so we found that in the case of veteran labor and social movement activists in Korea, protesters really embraced drama and ritual. Their embrace of it has heightened their political, and in many cases, reignited their political passions and spurred them to carry on the spirit of sacrifice and suffering, much of which was rooted in their staunch opposition to decades of military rule and authoritarian industrialization. But it wasn't only the kind of veteran activists that you usually see at protest sites, not just the usual suspects. We also began to observe the activation of younger generations, right? Younger generations of activists and artists who were not only supporting workplace struggles and union disputes by workers, but a range of social movement causes, from civic and human rights and social and environmental justice to gender and LGBTQ plus equality. And all of them really became galvanized and enthusiastic supporters who would travel near and far to support these spectacular acts of protest in a more kind of familiar and recognizable repertoire. Even ordinary citizens new to political activism as part of the massification of public protest, which, some of you may have become familiar with because of the kind of mass and sort of long-term kind of street mobilizations that we've seen in Korea known as the Candlelight protests. They also kind of in participating in this protest repertoire would start to take an interest because unionized workers were often at the same places, right? If the Candlelight protests would congregate in Gwanghwamun Square, which could hold millions of protesters, you would see aggrieved workers having their occupation protests, their high altitude occupations, and even hunger strikes in the same places. And, what we learned is while the nature and duration of solidarity would vary across different groups of supporters, right? Not everybody was there for the full 10 years. Together, over time and using kind of familiar places, they would come together to make sure that protesters were never abandoned, right? Despite the fact that there was intensifying internal fragmentation and repeated and ongoing failure. And as we show in the chapters of our book and through the many examples that you can read in the chapters, solidarity itself becomes a defining feature of the protest repertoire. And this protest repertoire not only expresses the grievances, especially around the refusal of precarity to define or foreclose the futures of workers, but it also, through solidarity, cultivates leadership, strengthens commitment, and really fosters alternative ways of caring for one another during these seemingly unwinnable fights against precarity. And at the crux of the book is the pursuit of what it means to refuse precarity and build solidarity in times of profound capitalist injustice. So the protesters that we follow and the protests that they wage are routinely disavowed. And, we don't want to give this impression that these types of protests are at the center of labor and social movements, right? Still, we see very militant strikes by unionists that exercise their numerical strength through the show of numbers. Yet we focus on the protests by minoritized workers, by women, in many cases, these disavowed protesters, for the very fact that they do not accept their disavowal, even after years of protesting. Instead, through their protests, they seek to alter the very grounds on which everyday social relations are reproduced and reproduced as sites of violence and dehumanization. They refuse their predicament as commodified labor with no institutional protection by the law for exercising their union rights. And they do so by inciting these affective politics and weaving together solidistic relations. And they refuse the terms of their disposability and abandonment by transforming the labor of social reproduction, not only of themselves, but of the protests, the life of protests over time. And they do that by transforming the kind of work it takes to sustain these protests over time from, quote, a stifling, discriminating activity into the most liberating and creative grounds of experimentation in human relations, end quote. And this is drawing on a quote from Silvia Federici. And some of the risks and harms that accumulate during the course of a struggle may defy common sense, but they inspire new ways of understanding how and under what conditions people take these kinds of extraordinary risks to transform unjust worlds.
And these extraordinary risks look quite ordinary in some cases. And this is a section on where protesters sleep. The photograph is by an activist photographer named Jung Tae-kyung, who's we've had the privilege of including many of his photographs in the book. And this photo is from his 7th major collection of photojournalism that was published in 2016. And he's well known for capturing iconic and dramatic scenes of protest. And to be sure, his photos usually offers his photography usually offers captivating glimpses into the extraordinary repertoires that we discuss in the book, and such as the dramatic form, like the prostration. But also remarkable are the repeated juxtapositions of the ordinary and the extraordinary, the spotlight on the mundane arrangements of everyday life spaces in which bodies are at rest or sleeping, even amidst protest. So in this image, taken on, this is June 6th. It's an aerial view of striking train attendants from the KTX bullet train, taken on June 6, 2006, just 2 months after 350 KTX workers were fired via text for forming a union and initiating a strike against the Korea Railroad Corporation. As you can see, they're gathered in a cordoned-off section of a busy terminal inside the Seoul train station, and the young female KTX unionists, alongside fellow unionists from the Korean Railroad Workers Union, are scattered across the seat cushions and floor mats, enclosed by union banners and protest signs. They're talking, they're eating, and a few are on the floor in sleeping positions. These images provide a glimpse into the unexpected and often hazardous places where striking workers in South Korea can find places to sleep. Jung Tae-kyung's photographs show how the unlikely and discomforting places of where protesters sleep in ways that protest conditions parallel the precariousness of life itself. The challenges of protesting and sleeping in public space make indispensable the questions of collective care and social reproduction. The intimate spaces of caring for oneself and each other while engaged in long-term fights shed light on the transformative praxis of everyday life spaces and the collective political practice of life and living in solidarity. The diverse range of activities that keep life going for protesters in long-term public occupations is not simply a matter of addressing basic needs. The specific needs, sensibilities, and desires of protesters highlight the gendered and power-laden dynamics and subject formations that in turn shape the everyday spaces of protesting and sleeping in public. So, for instance, one might expect militant unionists to simply sleep in the streets in the hundreds. That is simply not possible for young female train attendants. There are gendered forms of mass assembly and mass protest that require a more careful and nuanced attention to how bodies and spaces align with the politics and the aims of their campaigns. Dwelling for months in makeshift shelters or indefinitely occupying public spaces, public places requires creative and resourceful negotiations with the environments in which the protesters find themselves. And one reason that I particularly like this photo is because I don't know if you can see sort of towards the left side of the center of the photo, you see the shoes. I don't know if you can tell what that means. That's a demarcation of indoor space and outdoor space. You enter through the left side and you take your shoes off to enter the places where you're welcome, as like in a protest space that resembles an indoor space where shoes are not allowed. And that's also the spaces where you can find people resting and sleeping. Another photo that we didn't include in the book is also by the same photographer, Jang Tae-kyung. And this is KTX unionists during the occupation taking care of themselves, doing skincare. We were also able to hear about all the various ways that they took care of themselves and each other, and found moments of joy and pleasure, and found ways to sustain their effort. And that doesn't require simply chanting movement slogans or singing movement songs. And so just really thinking of protest spaces in this way, I think, have really enriched our understanding of what it means to protest, what it means to protest together and in solidarity.
So throughout the chapters of the throughout the chapters of the book, you'll read many vignettes of the kind of work of solidarity that is taking place to support these protests. And that work of solidarity, stretches from everything from the typical background work that many sort of activists and organizers do to publicize a protest, to put together a program, organize speakers, arrange the stage, have the food, to really the kind of emotional and care work it takes to live in communal space, oftentimes deprived of the kind of everyday comforts and luxuries that you might be used to, and the tensions and the conflicts that emerge from that. And, in conclusion, if you're going to take away sort of one thing from our book, what we wanted to do was really shift the frame and trying to understand sort of why people would engage in these types of grueling protests, from a focus on desperation and even failure, to thinking about what these protests actually do to change the people who protest and the people who witness them throughout sort of these long durations, what they do to actually change their everyday social relations and even their outlook on the world. So for us, really understanding caring as part of the political practices of protest work is central. The refusal of protesting workers to accept the legitimacy of a system that really treats them as disposable, like getting fired over text, and really depriving them of their worth and dignity by comparing them to like a single-use disposable cup, directed our attention to the creation of these alternative modes of living and caring for one another, beyond the capitalist value systems of accumulation and commodification, including setting up these occupations in their very work sites and creating new modes of caring for themselves and one another. And even when um, we think about the fact that sometimes all supporters can do is sit by and witness these tremendous acts of resolve and self-harm, including in these kind of protracted hunger strikes. Solidarity is essentially about being there. And it represents this commitment to care about and care for each and every life, refusing to abandon one another, at all costs. And so it really kind of changes our optics of understanding protests from mass mobilization and the public displays of as many people as possible to, what it takes to make sure that a protester doesn't feel abandoned in their fight and knows that they're not alone. And sort of at the end of it, this is what we understood solidarity to be. And one thing, Judy and I joke about is that it took us, over a decade and a half to come up with the argument that solidarity is really about being there, even, especially when no one else is. And we want to end with thinking about what these protest practices mean for our understanding of hope, and the kind of hope that Marian Kaba, another abolitionist, Black abolitionist scholar, emphasizes must be made and remade as "quote unquote" a lived practice. And we are heartened to know that in a world full of gross injustice and genocidal violence, social movements are radically reimagining our collective futures through the hard work of enacting solidarity in disciplined and embodied ways. And we end with this sense of hope in the ongoing history of resistance and perseverance, and perhaps importantly, emboldened by what we have seen in the power of refusal to abandon one another. Thanks so much. Okay, so that's the end of our sort of reading, so that we make sure we have time for some discussion.
Yeah.
Peter, should we answer the questions, or what would be the best way to?
Yeah, if you would like, or I could call some of the questions from the chat, and I think they're coming through. Jim asks, to what extent did you see transnational networks engage in solidarity and advocacy with labor unions in East Asia and beyond in support of South Korean protesters?
So transnational solidarity from outside of South Korea expressing solidarity with South Korean movements. I think that's where the question is coming from. What do you think, Jennifer? Not so much. That wasn't quite the focus for. There was so much going on within South Korea among South Korean workers, and obviously South Korean leaders seeking connections and support from outside of South Korea. So inter-Asian networks, obviously, with other labor movements and social movements in the global South. But the kind of cases that we looked at weren't necessarily dependent or reliant on, say, support from outside of South Korea. But
Yeah, maybe what I'll add is that, especially for the Korean labor movement, which is, very much plugged into international, global union networks and international kind of social movement networks, you will see the kind of very familiar kinds of transnational solidarity. So, for example, one of the most kind of well-known cases, Kiryong Electronics, where you saw their Oche Tuji full body, prostration. We saw New York-based activists really sort of getting involved, and we also saw. Activists, connected through these global unions, bring attention to a lot of the protracted struggles. And, I would include, for example, the Ssangyong Auto Workers Union, which, became kind of, it's the inspiration for the, the blockbuster Netflix hit Squid Game. That struggle also evoked a lot of transnational solidarity. The point that Judy's making and what we saw is that that's not exactly the kind of solidarity that is produced as a sustaining force for the kinds of protests that we saw. And really what we wanted to do was kind of shift our understanding of solidarity to these kind of, really more verbal and sort of ephemeral sort of acts of protest, to the hard work of what kind of solidarity it takes to sustain, the bodies of protesters that hunger strike for, 40, 60, 90 days, or who waged these occupation protests for 2, 5, 10 years.
Yeah.
Nancy. Oops, sorry.
Yeah.
Please.
So go ahead. So just one quick thing to, again, just reiterate that point about solidarity. I think we've come to realize that solidarity is a lot more about making these declarations of shared political sentiments or ideological alignment, but rather being present, being co-present by supporting each other, by caring for one another in the most mundane and ordinary ways. And this kind of solidarity is what sustains the politics of these movements too.
Wow. Let's see. Nancy asks, I was curious about what the women train attendants achieved as a result of their protests.
Yeah, they won reinstatement, actually. After so many years, and obviously not everyone stayed in the union, so not everyone was reinstated. But many of them did get their jobs back, except most of them did not return as train attendants or sort of the crew of the bullet train, either because those positions were not available anymore or because they no longer fit the criteria for that job. But they took administrative positions instead. So I think that's the other interesting thing about these seemingly hopeless and desperate struggles. It's that sometimes, many times, in fact, and maybe even more than you might imagine, they win. They do win. They win reinstatement. They win compensation. They do win justice. So even if it's a minority, and even if we think it's a significant minority.
Okay. Actually, I had a question, and it's about shamanism. Do you find an influence at all in maybe the shape that some resistance takes? And then do you find value in archaic currents like that?
Shamanism, not so much, but we actually, there's a whole chapter featuring almost an entire chapter is about a Catholic nun and other nuns. We actually worked closely with a lot of religious clergy who were in solidarity with the worker struggles. And it's usually the Catholic, the Buddhist, Anglican, and some Protestant religious groups. The shamanistic traditions are there culturally, but not necessarily in organized forms in support of politics. So I wouldn't have expected to have come across shamanism per se, but religion and faith-based organizing, for sure, they're absolutely everywhere.
And one thing I might also add is that, death, like in so many movements, in revolutionary and liberation struggles, is really a catalyst. And, we saw that sort of time and time again. And so, one kind of significant characteristic of so many of these kind of protracted struggles that we looked at was public commemoration, kind of a practice of memorializing through respect for those who have passed and are, sort of ancestors of the social movement. And in a lot of ways, that kind of memory of what people did before you to really fight oppression, to really endure kind of like suffering when you take this risk against power, that gets produced and reproduced in these kind of public displays of things like faith, of practices of mourning the dead, in even thinking about sort of hunger strikes or prostration protests. And that prostration protest is actually not Korean. The Korean protest is 108 vows, but it's actually a Tibetan Buddhist practice. So there's a lot of, I guess, in thinking about transnational, that might be another way of
That's
thinking
one,
about
yeah.
that. Because it was the environmental justice protesters protesting the building of incredibly destructive dams that brought that Buddhist prostration practice, Oche-tuji and Sambu, Oche-tuji, like to Korea's protest sector.
It seems like a very important moment, I think, for activists all around the world to be able to learn from each other. If you could maybe talk a little bit about that too, just that how, one can begin thinking about, connecting with other activists, but also, what it is that, especially here in this country, what it is that we have to learn. We were talking a little bit about this before the, talk began. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where the idea of repertoires really captivated our attention in this book. In that often, it might be tempting for activists to look for a solution that can be applied across history, across geography, across, if only there was a protest form that can result in X or Y. No such thing exists, I don't think. If I can make a declarative statement, is that just doesn't happen, because all the conditions have to line up in the same way. In South Korea, the kind of mass protests, like the Candlelight protests that twice already in the last 10 years have resulted in regime change, that have removed the president. I mean, this is the stuff that I think many Americans, fantasize about. And we've actually gotten that question a lot. Like, how can American activists, for instance, how can US-based social activists, accomplish what the Korean activists have, seem to have achieved? Well, it's not in the protest form per se, or it's not even in the movement organizing alone. It's also one way that I talk about the Candlelight protests, and I think we talk about this in the book too, is that if only in the US there was a city like Seoul, which would be the combination of San Francisco, LA, DC, Chicago, and all the major cities in the US combined into one. And on top of it, there's hugely accessible public transportation network that can gather and disperse millions of people without incident. And on top of it, there are public restrooms that are readily available for everyone, which is actually key to public assembly. So if those material conditions can be provided, then maybe we can talk about the protest form and what the political, the movements were able to accomplish. But that's just one example of how some of these conditions, I think, absolutely structure what's possible and what's not. But bathrooms aside, we do really like this thing about the bathrooms or the restrooms. But the restrooms aside, I do think that part of what I've learned a lot from working on this book is how not to continue to look at protest forms or specific campaigns as recipes, as something that can yield success, but rather to really think of them as this ongoing repertoire of people doing a number of things differently, hoping for different outcomes. Even if they're doing the same thing, you hope for a different outcome. Isn't that what a script does? Isn't that what a repertoire does? And I think it's in thinking about protests as not as these one-off events or acts, but as a group of struggles. I think therein lies some clue as to what might be possible.
And I might, in responding to your question, Peter, which I think is the vital one right now, when I think about sort of what these protests aim to do and what they actually did, I think two things that we often don't think about when thinking about a sort of demand-driven or, head-driven protest is that, um, you know, the doing and feeling and witnessing of protests has material effects, right? And one thing we found is that it produces these caring infrastructures, right? It changes the everyday relations of how we think about what a protest does in my life. And, here we think, oh, there's a protest, but I don't have time to do it. We're all so busy, But one of the really interesting things about what's happened in Korea over the last 20 years is that going to a protest, supporting people, financially contributing, it's part of the daily life of people who have built this movement. So it's not such a big divide. And I think that's something that we can learn from is that, it's not kind of we never have time to protest, right? But if we think about protests differently as all the different things that we can do to support people who are willing to put their bodies on the line, that's one thing that we can learn. And I think another thing that we can learn is that these protests very much are about transforming place, our use of place, and our relationship to each other in place. And the one amazing thing about the Candlelight protests and every other protest that used public space is that I just really enjoyed the city. You know what I mean? It's kind of like when you go to grand performances in LA, you're like, why don't we use this space more, right? We have so much commercialized space, and that's kind of the raison d'etre of the accumulation machine, But to be able for protesters to really be able to enjoy what the city has to offer and the public space of it, the skyline, the public bathrooms, the transportation networks, that's also part of what these protests did, was demand, not just as a sort of democratic right to space, but in the use value of it. And so for me, those two things are also essential. We should think about protests as also transforming the way we even move in the world and in our cities and in our neighborhoods.
And I think one thing that I also don't want to do is to exceptionalize or, sort of highlight South Korea as if it's completely different from everything we know in the US. I think a lot of what we're saying about solidarity, obviously, these things are at work currently, at the current moment in the US as well, whether it's, mutual aid or various collective, community defense networks that are coming together. We're just adding to the conversation by highlighting, I think, many cases that I think a lot of people don't, in the States, for instance, know very little about, which is South Korean women workers in the labor movements, especially.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Nancy asks, does the Korean media cover these public protests well so the general public can support them?
Yeah. What do you, yeah, how do you think we should, yeah, yes?
I think it depends on kind of how we're thinking about the Korean media. I mean, I think one thing that is also kind of I would say kind of exceptional about the Korean media space is that there is so much kind of movement media too. And of course, like in our digital age, there's the mainstream corporate media, not so much. They're going to be covering more of the kind of militant union protests and sort of framing their demands in a particular way that will kind of, turn the public against them. But, these smaller protests, um, blogs, websites, social media very much covered a lot of these protest actions so that, sometimes I would be there and, there was just a few people kind of witnessing, but there's still a life now. You can actually see a lot of these types of protests in action, kind of recorded, YouTube, social media, things like that.
And a really vibrant scene of documentary, filmmakers and other video activists and activist media as well. So I do think there's a pretty diverse landscape of media and media coverage. Having said that, I don't think it's necessarily from the media that people get their information and find out information about how to attend a protest. I think we're also talking about a country with a great deal of mobilization and mobilized public, where people are plugged in and tapped into different networks, whether it's through political networks or school or religious networks, and these things all play a role in the turnout.
Well, we have come to the top of the hour. And on behalf of City Lights, I really would love to thank both of you for gracing our virtual halls. It has been such a pleasure and an honor. And I'd like to thank all of you who joined us tonight. We have posted links in the chat with which you may purchase books. We have copies of Against Abandonment, or better yet, if you're in the hood, please do come on down, pay us a visit. We would love to see you. We are located in San Francisco's historic North Beach District, and we're open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. Today's program has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our community outreach, and our publishing program, and all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So Goodbye, everyone. Take care. Stay strong. We hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.